Hi, everyone. So I just told Joachim that he slightly ruined my whole presentation because I no longer want to talk about what I was going to talk about. I really want to talk about what he talked about because I could not agree with him more. I think, and especially in this part of the world, I'm myself Georgian, and I recently was at this judging a competition of investigative reporting in Georgia, and I had to read about 50 articles, all of which were full of incredible facts, and the amazing amount of digging went into the journalism. But with each story, I would read it, and I would just have no idea what that story was about. And I think now it's more important than ever for all of us to become better storytellers and to engage without. And when people talk about audience engagement, I think the most important way in which we can engage with audience is by telling really good stories. But it does link very directly with what I do at Coda Story, which is a media platform. It's a journalism platform. We're very, very new. And our ethos, the basic idea behind it, is that we stay on a story. So we follow a story for an extended period of time, and we explore all the different elements of it. And we're very much about on-the-ground reporting, character-based reporting, narrative reporting, rather than, fact-checking is really should be just part of journalism, full stop. But rather than opinion or analysis and so on. And I'd like to tell you how kind of Coda, the idea of Coda was born, and I think why I think it's so relevant today. I spent my entire journalism career working for the BBC. I was a foreign correspondent based in different places, and during the Arab Spring, I covered Yemen a lot, and I would go a lot to Yemen to first cover the uprising and then the war that was born out of the uprising. And it became harder and harder to get into Yemen. And I remember very distinctly on one of the trips, I had spent 6 weeks in the country completely on my own, posing as a tourist. And I was getting out, and BBC was not replacing me because they didn't have anyone, no one could get a visa, no one could fly in. And I was sitting in the airport having spent very intense 6 weeks reporting on a story and the people involved in it, and knowing full well that me leaving would mean that story would completely drop off the radar. Not because it was over, not because nothing else would happen, but because there was no one else on the ground. And because there was no one on the ground to be pushing the story, the attention of editors would also move elsewhere. Not because I was so important that I drove the story, but it makes a huge difference. If you have someone on the ground who is calling London or New York or Paris, whatever your headquarters is, and pushing this story, the story is much more likely to stay in the headlines. And it was after that, and this is a pattern that happens again and again and again in international reporting. We all the journalists know the drill. Something big happens, we all descend on it, we cover the hell out of it, and then we all leave because we all have other commitments and families and things that are going on, and something else happens in the world, and we need to go and move on to something else, and stories get abandoned. Look at what's happening with the coverage of Eastern Ukraine in the international media right now. Not because there is no war anymore, but because the attention of editors moved elsewhere. So it was after that trip to Yemen that I started thinking about, whether there is a way of doing it differently, whether there is a way of covering these big issues differently. One of the examples that we always brought was I think one of the best examples of why it's so important to stay in the story was the NATO bombing of Libya. With Libya, we had the NATO campaign that ended with the execution of Gaddafi, and it was the headline news throughout, on all the channels, everywhere. And then literally there was nothing for 6 months, literally nothing. There were no news from Libya for 6 months. And then there was a bombing in Benghazi, and the US ambassador was killed. An event that had enormous implications and on Hillary Clinton, the election campaign, the rise of Donald Trump, and really what's happening today. But we, as the readers, as the audience, and really in journalism, there was a vacuum that was created between the bombing and between the NATO campaign and the Benghazi. And it's these vacuums in the media, in the coverage, in the media coverage of events that really hamper our understanding of the world. We still, still in journalism have not really learned how to present the world in a way that it really functions as a complex, interconnected series of events. So we started, I reached out to a bunch of colleagues of mine whose opinion I valued, and we started this discussion of, is there a way of doing it differently? And one of the things that we discovered along the way throughout this discussion as the concept of Coda was being born was the fact that actually one of the reasons why journalism is very bad at staying on the story is because journalism was never designed to stay on the story. And I think that's something that's really important for journalists to understand, to kind of change their attitude towards storytelling. So if you think about traditional media, you think about the newspaper, or television, all of them were always disposable platforms. You buy your newspaper, you read it, you throw it out. Yeah, you see a television piece, you watch it once, it goes out, and then it's out. That's it. It goes on a shelf somewhere, but you never see it again. And that makes it very hard for reporters to stay on characters or stay on stories or to serialize the events, to put them in context, to really gain that depth. Because each time we tell the story, we have to tell it from scratch. Because for every morning edition of your newspaper, you have to assume that you can't assume that your readers have read the previous version, right? So you have to tell it from scratch. Now, the digital world fundamentally changed that, but our mentality, the media mentality, never changed. We treated the online for years and years, and that's now changing, but for years we treated it the same way we treated the old platforms, as disposable. So instead of, so what we did with the internet, we turned it into this basically bottomless pit of updates. We would just update the stories and write a new story every time, and the workload increased, and newspaper journalists who used to go out to file their copy and used to go out for a nice drink at the bar suddenly could no longer go for a drink at the bar and had to file another update and another update for the online. So when we started talking about Coda and how do you create a platform that stays on the story, we basically started thinking about how do you take the big issue, a big event, and really kind of fold it out and map it out and kind of create a much more comprehensive sort of picture, a complex picture of the events that are happening. So the formula that we came up with is super simple, and what's on the screen here is really probably at 10% right now of what we want Coda to be, and we're getting there. But in terms of design and the look, it's in very, very basic stages. But the formula is very simple. We take one big story, one big event, be it we did our prototype on the war in Ukraine, but any big crisis would basically work as a Coda. And we put a team of journalists on that story, and very importantly, we identify the trends that we call currents that run through that crisis. So we started out last year with a very small pilot project. We're non-profit, so we're crowdfunded and started with the crowdfunding and a small foundation grant. And we did our pilot project on LGBT rights in the former Soviet Union. And we picked the topic because it's a topic that it's a prism through which you can really explain a lot of what's happening in this part of the world. And it also, did not involve sending people into war zones and paying for hostile environment training and insurance and all the expenses for which we didn't have the money. But we looked at the LGBT, at the gay rights, but not just from the point of view of gay rights, but more from the point of view of trying to explain kind of the war on gays. And in order to do that, we identified 4 themes that ran through it. 5, sorry, been a while. So it was Kremlin influence, and that was a current in which we looked at stories of how the Kremlin anti-gay rhetoric is spreading through other countries in the former Soviet Union and actually beyond Eastern Europe. It was the Orthodox Church looking at the stories of the role that church plays. It was the East-West divide of kind of this natural tension between the traditionalism and the pull of liberalism and so on. The information war of how things were covered, and the rights abuses, or looking at the victims. And each story that we published basically lived in one of the currents. And having these currents basically is what allowed us to sort of create this continuation of, coverage, or like to stay on these trends and explain these trends. In the future, the platform that we're developing, the currents will look very differently. They will look much more like a map with dots that are stories that are connected, and with the interaction between the different trends and so on. But it's work in progress. So our second, the edition that we launched this year, already in kind of a full form, is looking at the disinformation crisis. And this is where I would like to go back more to what Joachim was talking about. The reason we picked disinformation, and there was if we had launched it when we wanted to launch it, we would have been way ahead of the curve, but it took a while to get the funding. But the reason why we wanted to do the disinformation crisis was because we felt it was very important to try to do narrative reporting about what disinformation is. We all know, we all talk about this post-truth world. We all talk about fake news and the facts, and some of us are doing amazing work in fact-checking and countering disinformation and so on. But what we really wanted to do is to show the effect of disinformation on our lives. What does it actually mean? Like, how does it change our lives? And much of it was very much inspired by Ukraine, actually, because throughout I covered the war in the East for the BBC, and I was always, not from the beginning, but towards the end I realized that Western media in Ukraine made a massive mistake by ignoring the whole disinformation angle of the story for a really, really long time. We simply repeated the narratives. Most of us did the he said, she said journalism, kind of, showing this side and showing that side, instead of really trying to dissect and show the effects of fake news and disinformation in Ukraine. And it is the war that was very much fueled by fake news and by disinformation, and yet we almost didn't have the tools, we didn't think hard enough. And the reason we didn't goes back to the fact that in journalism, we don't think about staying on the story. We don't think, the news journalism is very much designed on kind of getting the story out, rather than trying to understand what the story is. So building on that, on kind of the lessons that we learned in Ukraine, in Eastern Ukraine, we wanted to create a platform that really tried to sort of not just do myth-busting, but also really tell the stories of how disinformation and fake news affects the lives and so on. And It's hard because our main challenge is we see each other. I'm often asked, "Is this an investigative platform?" And no, I don't think it is. People are very liberal with the word investigation. A lot of journalists say that they are investigative journalists without actually being investigative journalists. I think OCCRP does real hardcore investigations. I think ProPublica does real hardcore investigations. I think, the Washington Post and Reuters investigative units do really great investigations. But it takes a hell of a lot of resources. I mean, Yanukovych leaks, where we're sitting, amazing investigation. But a lot of other stuff that is labeled investigation is something else. And it's just as necessary and needed as those, sweating through the data. And it's just as important to tell those, to apply the idea of exciting storytelling to stories that are not necessarily, that don't necessarily involve months and months and months of research. So Coda is somewhere in between, and above all, Coda is a story. I see Coda as a storytelling platform. I think by the virtue of us focusing on one subject at a time and really going very deep and having a team of reporters that is very, very focused on the subject, I think we end up, having an investigative edge, and we become a resource for, people who are interested in a certain subject. But what my ambition is really to create a platform that above all is a storytelling platform, because I completely agree with you, Akim. I think it is the most important thing that journalists have to do. We need to get out of our silos. We need to stop being journalists for journalists, and we need to figure out a way of telling the stories to the outside audiences, to people who don't, are not necessarily engaged already. And we need to be creative at doing that. And there are plenty of examples. That's why, when, I don't know how many of you were at the morning session. But, and I think Washington Post Investigative Unit does fantastic work, and they do amazing stuff. But I fundamentally disagree with that notion of, our job is to check facts and to get the facts right and then put them out there, and it doesn't matter if they don't want to read it, they don't want to read it. I think it's our responsibility to also present them in such a way that makes people watch it and think about it, and makes people want to basically keep reading. And I think it's our biggest challenge today, and I think all of us have to be tackling it head on, and especially in this part of the world where storytelling is, unfortunately, I really see it's massively lagging behind our ability to investigate and dig up the facts. So I really want to make this more into a discussion, but I'll give you a couple of examples of how we are trying to do some of the storytelling. For example, one of the things, there are a lot of there are a lot of experiments that we're currently involved in. I mean, the currents and kind of the themes is one, and giving our readers an ability to follow the theme that they're interested in within a crisis is kind of one way. But another way is, our challenge was, how do you make disinformation interesting? What do you do? And so much about disinformation is the fact that it polarizes society, right? All of us live in very, very polarized societies right now, whether you're in the United States or in Europe or in Ukraine. And so one example, for example, that we we just finished the pilot recently, and we're hoping to kind of carry on doing this series across the region. We decided, to kind of trying to figure out how the hell do we tell the story of disinformation and this echo chambers and polarization. We came up with this concept of a video series called The Clash of Narratives. And it's a super simple idea. We take two characters, two strong, interesting, involved characters who are on two opposite sides of the argument, of a narrative, and we follow these characters for an extended period of time with very intimate sort of video storytelling. And I'll show you. I won't show you the whole thing because it's a 3-part series, but I'll show you just the beginning of it to give you like a little taste of what it's like. So this is we did the pilot in Georgia, and it followed our two protagonists, our two characters were two women, both of them in their early 40s, both owners of TV stations, both very articulate and quite charming, one fiercely pro-Russian, another one fiercely pro-Western. I'll play, I mean, it's all out there, so you can watch the rest of it later, but I'll play you the...
აგდებს ახლა თანამედროვე მსოფლიო იმას, რასაც მე მაგალითად ფსევდოლიბერალებს უწოდებ და ფსევდოლიბერალურ ღირებულებებს დაიღალა, გადააგდო და მიდის რაღაცა სხვა სიახლეებისკენ. და ეს სხვა სიახლეები რა არის? დაბრუნება არის ისევ წარსულთან სინამდვილეში.
The other side that says that we want no West because they're going to make us gay, they're going to make us like sort of lose our traditions, take away our, I don't know, religion. So these are the phobias they are trying to, you know, like sort of generate, because we all know that what Russia wants. They want to restore like the Soviet Union. I have no doubt that
Fake news is
Fake news. Post-truth.
off in the elementary school.
James Comey announced.
Why not? Why not?
მე ვარ ჟურნალისტი, ტელეჟურნალისტი და ვცდილობ, რომ ჩემ თავს არ ვუწოდო პოლიტიკოსი, რომ მე დარწმუნებული ვარ, რომ პოლიტიკოსი რომ
I'll pause it. But it's just a little taste. So it was a three-part series. Each episode was about 7 minutes. And it was very interesting to see and right now we're developing the same basically idea for other countries in the former Soviet Union, in Ukraine and in the Baltics and so on. But it was really interesting to see the reactions to the series. They did really well in Georgia, but but elsewhere as well. Very, one of the kind of most watched things that we've done. But I think one thing that worked, and I think that was a really big lesson for us, was the fact that, I don't think journalism doesn't often have the capacity to change people's minds, and especially when the world is so polarized and when the world is so divided. But what we did by putting these two characters, Tamara and Irma, in the same TV series, giving them a very kind of fair amount of time, and I was very nervous about what they would think about it, and I thought the best result would be if they both hated it, but actually they both loved it. And what it achieved was basically that we got people, both of their supporters, watch the other side. And I think it's just that exposure to the other side is what, is to me an achievement, because it's to me just a one small way of getting out of the silo, of the echo chambers that we are in. But when it comes to storytelling, it's basically so much of in this series, if you watch it, so much of it basically goes exactly. It's very serious. It has an intrigue. You don't know, like every episode ends, and you don't know what it uses all the basic techniques of good storytelling, and most importantly, it really humanizes these two characters who are on Georgian TV all the time, are very well known, but we see them in their kitchens and we see them with their families, and they're much more human and they're much more like us, and that makes it much more watchable. And that's that thing about storytelling, right? Stories should be about humans, and we all like stories about other people because that's who we relate to. I'll show you a couple other examples of what we are trying to do in terms of storytelling, and I think it's right here. and serializing stuff and staying on the themes and the subjects. So we have a series that we call Jailed for a Like, and we're basically tracing cases of Russians who are who've been prosecuted for the use of social media. So this is a teaser for the whole series, just about a minute long, but gives you an idea of what it is.
Лев, чудновец. Сейчас
не опубликовать, а просто написать текст. Могла написать, а вы делаете, вот текстом можно.
Вы ставите лайк, вы делаете перепост. С точки зрения закона это распространение.
Меня осудили по уголовному делу разжигания ненависти и вражды. Говорили обо мне, что я извращенец, что я фашист, изменник, предатель Родины, остальных людей. Сидите и молчите. Вот слушайте Первый, Второй канал, вам там все подробно, популярно объяснят, зачем вам что-то еще нужно, какие-то альтернативные точки зрения. И, кстати, это власти очень сильно удалось. Народ запугали очень сильно.
Святый Боже, святый крепкий, святый бессмертный, помилуй нас. Святый Боже, святый крепкий, святый бессмертный.
Просто вот молча зашел, там снял, вышел. Пошел, снял, выложил. Потом осудили это дело. Об оскорблении чувства верующих.
Again, in terms of storytelling, one of the things that we've been experimenting a lot, and one of the wonderful things about digital media, and we're not alone, obviously, but many people are doing it, but the use of art and the use of artists and the use of graphics and sort of reimagining what you can do with the images. I think we are so lucky to be journalists in this in this era when there's so many more tools available to us to make stories interesting and exciting and different. In cases where, you can't, there's what Joachim was saying about with documentaries and kind of trying to follow the serializing stuff. That's one way. Another way of trying to employ techniques like, using art. The stories tend to do really, really well, or hooking the audience and getting the message out and making sure that you are watched and listened to. I'll show you one last example in terms of this, from the disinformation edition of Coda, and then I'll just open up to questions if you guys have any. So this was a story of. This is a story written by a Russian journalist who who worked for local Moscow government-controlled television. So and again, this is he wrote us a text piece which we ran, but this was we then decided to visualize it for social media, and we asked him to record part of the text, and we animated it, and we basically visualized his words, and here's and it's his voice. It sounds, some people find it a little weird, but it is his voice.
I focused on reporting issues as far removed from politics as possible. New metro line, about bad road conditions, extraordinary traffic jams. On that level there was no censorship, and sometimes it even felt like I was doing real journalism. Still, my profession made me feel uncomfortable with myself, and after Crimea it went from bad to worse. There would be no time for truth-seeking now. Our editors told us our country is living in a Cold War era. From our studios, we were teaching the entire country the whole new vocabulary. Junta, Ukrainian government. Batchas, Ukrainian army. The fifth column, Russian opposition. None of these words were used in a private conversation in a newsroom, but still working there felt like swimming in a shark tank.
So, I think, I can carry on, but I think if you have questions, I can carry on if you don't have questions, but if you have questions, let's go.
How would you describe the current state of journalism and investigative journalism in particular in Georgia? Because I know that there is this general sense of apathy in Georgia now, and like the reversal reforms after the euphoria of the Saakashvili era, and something similar is happening in Ukraine right now, like the reversal reforms. And as far as I know, you moved out of Georgia. So what's the situation with journalism? Is it robust in Georgia? Is it dead? What's happening there?
It's neither. It's neither robust nor dead. I think it's very present, but it's fragile, just like the democracy itself. I think there is plenty of good journalism. I think, again, and that's why I think Joachim's session was so important, I think there is a real lack of good storytelling, which makes it much harder to get the stories to people because we're just not very good at packaging them. But I think there's plenty of really good journalism. I think a lot of it is under threat because the main kind of the face of it is Rustavi. The face of kind of non-governmental, like opposition journalism is Rustavi too, and Rustavi too is under massive pressure. But I think, I think it's there. It's not hopeless at all. I think journalists are there. I think in many ways it has, just like Trump has been great for the American journalism, in many ways the current government has been great for Georgian journalism because it certainly has inspired people to ask tougher questions and dig deeper. Anyone? Should we take that one?
What's the main idea of your workshop?
Good question. Well, the main idea is the importance of why we should stay on the story. That was the workshop. But as I said, I told Joachim after his session, I said, I think you ruined my presentation because now I want to talk about the importance of good storytelling. Although I think the two are very, very linked because I think it's often staying on the story that allows us to do good storytelling, but also it's a waste to stay on a story if you can't tell it well.
So, can you hear me? Yeah.
I think unfortunately that goes without a question. It seems to be the case. People prefer video to text. I personally find it tragic because I spend most of my career in television, but I still prefer reading to watching something. But I think video is something that all of us have to be thinking very, very hard about because by next year, 70% of Facebook feed will be video. And as anyone who is publishing probably knows really well how much more effective video is on social media, which is one of the main distribution platforms for all media organizations these days. And videos just do so much better than text pieces. So yes, it's very important. We run, 70% of what we published is actually text rather than video. We also do some audio stuff as well, but with partners. We partner with radio stations in the United States. But one of the things that we've been trying, and something that has worked really well, is visualizing, taking long reads and taking really long text pieces and visualizing them into 1-minute videos for social media, just to make that information available for people who don't read. Sure. I mean, as you see, this is a promo, yeah? A lot of these videos are promos, so we are hoping that, I mean, and it is bringing some people in. I think it's working, but yeah, most people just watch video. I mean, a lot of people don't get beyond 3 seconds, you know? It's very depressing looking at your actual statistics, but, you know, it's a million. If you find out, tell me, because I want to know. But I think we need to tell good stories. I think we need to, and again, going back to what Joachim said, we have a question here actually, that one. But I think going back to what Joachim said, you know, we need to tell really good stories. We need to get beyond stating facts, because I think, boring as it is, I think people care a lot less about facts than they care about narratives. And I think, you know, Russian television is a place from which we can learn a lot, because they are really, really good at spinning narratives. And, you know, if we can do kind of the same thing, but, you know, using fact-based narratives, I think we as journalists collectively would do a lot better. Do you want to, can we take a question here? She's been trying for a long time, and then the back, yeah.
I would be very curious to see the rest of the video before asking my question, but as it's not possible, I will ask it now. I'm wondering if you found it problematic with one of the, or maybe both of the women, that their world vision would be so crazy that it wasn't playing by the rules of the game somehow, or that they would start to talk about conspiracies or start to spread lies or something. And I find sometimes when you want to present two sides, it's too difficult because they are not talking about the same thing. But yeah. Was it this case, or?
I think it's a really good and really important question that kind of really sort of shines light on a much wider problem. I think in this case, it wasn't really the case, because what allowed us to avoid it was the fact that we really spent a lot of time with both of them. So there was a real, it really gave us the ability to show rather than tell, and to, you know, allow the viewer to come to their own conclusions. And if there was something that, I mean, there were in a couple of instances things that one of the characters said that were not true, we did use text to kind of say, you know, what the facts were. But I think it gets to another level with some of the kind of crazier stories that you want to tell. For example, I really wanted to do a similar series on the HIV dissident movement in Russia. People who don't believe that HIV exists, or they say that it's a Western project, but then that becomes very problematic, right? Like, do you give these people airtime or not? Like, how can you give these people airtime? So that's something where you have to think really, really deeply about. But I think in general, though, you know, what allows you in most, I mean, that's a really extreme case. I mean, because this is not just points of view. These are like psychos who say HIV isn't real, right? But I think in most cases there is some sort of, you know, there are legitimate points of view, and there are reasons why people say what they say. And if you spend enough time and kind of get into it, you really can, you know, build a much more complex and compelling picture than you do in your news report. The key is spending time with them. I think the coverage of Crimea, the international coverage of Crimea was one of the best examples of the problem that you mentioned. You know, this whole. I was there filing for the BBC, and it was so confusing because you know, you saw one thing and then Putin said another thing, and you basically didn't know what to say other than to do what you've always been taught to do, to present two sides. But by calling the Russian troops little green men, by basically just repeating the line from the Kremlin and calling them little green men, you reinforced that narrative. as a journalist. And what really lacked in everyone's coverage of Crimea was that nobody, not a single reporter, that came later, but at that point, not a single reporter went and did a story about Sasha from Chelyabinsk, who is sent to Crimea without his insignia to invade the peninsula. No one humanized that story. No one put a name and a face to this little green man. And it's possible. It just takes a lot longer, and it takes a way bigger commitment than the mainstream media is willing to give, because we're still, especially television, but also newspapers, it's all about, the sound bites and getting things out of there. News is important, but journalists need to learn from, especially in this post-truth era, which I also like, Roman was saying this, it's not post-truth, it's lies. We need to find a way of lobbying the true narratives more effectively. And I think later in the Ukraine war, there were examples of this being done very effectively. Simon Ostrovsky's Selfie Soldiers was a really good example of putting the face and the name to the story, and very effective storytelling. The Bellingcat investigation into MH17 was another, more fact-based than humanized, but another. But Crimea is a great example of how we as journalists, international journalists, totally failed at covering it and assisted the narrative that Russia was spinning.
Good afternoon. I have a question. I work in a human rights group, Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Group, and I'm really impressed by your video with Georgia, where you show the both sides, because it's very important sometimes involve people supporting the politicians so they see the other side. And because now our society in the country is very much split because of propaganda from both sides sometimes. And my question is, you showed also a video about, I forgot the topic, but it was like with visual art pictures, okay? And my question is, how do you usually do it? You hire the artist, or I don't know, you use like a special programs, kind of like Prism or something like this, because it's like something that people much more easier to involve and to get them interested with the story. Thank you.
I'll show you another example of that. Actually, I have it right here. When my computer wakes up. So we started this whole like artistic sketching story was actually we experimented first with it when we did our pilot on gay rights in the former Soviet Union, and we got this absolutely astonishing interview in Kyrgyzstan with a gay man who was gang raped in Kyrgyzstan, and it was a very, very strong audio interview, and we really wanted to visualize it, and we got an artist to draw pictures to it, and then we animated it. And then we had this idea again of tackling the problem of like how do you engage the audience and how do you get like more people to watch if they don't read and so on. We decided to experiment with visualizing the text pieces. So we would have a text piece and we would turn it into a 1-minute video. So what we did, we had a project together with Maidan TV, the Azeri media or non-profit media newsroom, and we within that project has now ended. But within that project, we set up a network of artists across the region. We have Russian, Ukrainian, Georgian, Azeri artists, and we have an animator, an in-house animator. So when the story comes in, we will. But we turn it into a 1-minute, into a script. We storyboard it. We come up with the images that we want, and then we pick an artist from the network that will illustrate it, depending on the style and so on. And I'll show you another example. We did this video for Maidan TV. This was done by Coda, but for Maidan TV. And it's about, I don't know if hopefully most of you heard about the abduction of the Nazari journalist in Georgia just last week. So this is Afghan Mukhtarli's story visualized by one of our artists. Sure. Any more questions? Yeah.
I am working in newspaper and we writing about economy, metallurgy, and how we can visualize it. It's very, very difficult. We trying to make infographics, for example, but to make video is very difficult. And how can in your country you make this?
Look, I think personally, I think infographics are really important. I find them really boring. I never really look at infographics, just as a news consumer. But I think, again, going back to what Joachim is saying and going back to the very idea that sort of Coda is based around, stories about economy are stories about people, tell stories about people, and that immediately makes it possible to both visualize them, to humanize them, to make your readers more interested in them. Tell the story of impact of the economic decisions or of mergers between the companies or anything. One great example just now. Recently, a couple of weeks ago, ProPublica, together with New York Times, published a story about Jared Kushner's, Trump's son-in-law, real estate empire. And it was told almost entirely through the story of the tenants, this poor woman in Baltimore who lost everything. And it had the drama in it, and it had, you sympathized with that woman. And what kept you reading wasn't the hard facts that they found that were fundamental to the story, but the human story of that woman. And that's what we're so bad at, especially in this part of the world, is finding this understanding what these stories are about. I mean, again, going back to Joachim's session, the one thing I always, the first thing when people pitch me stories, the first thing I ask is, what's the story about? And I am amazed how often people can't answer that question. My advice to journalists is always, this is a question that you should start asking yourself from when you from when you conceive and start researching the story to the very, very end until it's published. You should never stop asking yourself, what is my story about? What is my story about, and why does it matter? Because it matters only because it affects people and humans. And and no matter how it changes throughout your reporting, you need to keep answering that question, and you need to keep kind of seeing the connection between, I don't know, the merger of two big companies in Ukraine to like how it's going to affect people. Why should it matter to your readers? I think that's the way. And once you do that, then there are ways to visualize it as well. Through telling human stories and personal stories, which I think is always so much more powerful than infographics and bars and statistics and so on. I mean, statistics are important. I had this conversation during lunch earlier. There's a great saying that journalism is like an iceberg. Only the tip shows, but unless you have this a load of ice underneath, the tip is not going to float. All your facts and all your reporting and all of your statistics are that load of ice underneath, but it's that tip of the iceberg that carries that story, that makes it relevant and interesting and makes people care. One last question?
No, it's not rather a question, it's a little comment. Use the internet. There's a lot of free tools available. For example, by the Knight Center, they are providing a lot of powerful tools for digital storytelling for free. Hello. You mean okay, another thing, like watch a talk by Hans Rosling, who is talking about visualization of data. I think that's a good start, maybe. Hans Rosling.
Great, thank you very much.